There you go. Okay. All right. So my name is Alex Helms. I work here at the Southeast Purdue Ag Center. In 2019, we started some potassium research trials here at the SEPAC location outside of North Vernon. And then in 2020, we expanded that research to 2 other farms, one outside of Muncie and one outside of Fort Wayne. They all have the same field history, which is no potassium fertilizer since 2002, with all other management practices being maintained. So what you end up with is high fertility with phosphorus, maintained pH, et cetera, except very low soil test potassium. I'm mostly going to talk about the SEPAC data, but I'm going to briefly talk about the DPAC, the Davis Purdue Ag Center, outside of Muncie. So what you're seeing on the screen is their Kplot field, with the blue being the Glenwood soil type and the brown being the Pewamo soil type. Again, this field hasn't had potassium fertilizer in at least 2002, so almost a decade. And the Glenwood soil type, if you see in this top right corner, you know, potassium ranges in the 2020 sampling from like 50 to 80 parts per million. And then in the bottom left, in the Pewamo, you have soil test ranges from, you know, 150 to 200. And again, this is with, you know, cropping practices. So you have 180 bushel or more corn and, you know, 60 bushel or better soybeans being removed on that Pewamo soil type, with the soil types being maintained at very high levels. So if you could imagine a place where variable rate fertilizer would fortunately, we don't have that kind of soil type here in Southeast Indiana. So when we don't apply potassium for, you know, almost a decade, we get soil K levels down to about 25 parts per million. But like I said, all the other management practices were maintained. So we have relatively high phosphorus levels, with the organic matter pH and CEC sort of normal for the region. I'm going to mention briefly that these numbers are reported in the Malic-3 extractant, which your soil test that you would send off would be reported probably in the ammonium acetate or the Bray P1. So these are slightly higher than maybe what you would see. This 26 would maybe be about a 22 in your soil test. But the new tri-state moves to more of that Malic-3 reporting. So that's what we're going to report in here. So here at the SEPAC location, we had 2 fields that were almost identical, and we applied treatments in 2019 to one field. And then in 2020, we applied the same treatments in the other field and then planted corn to the soybean field from 2019 as the residual plot. If the potassium number, you know, 26 doesn't mean anything to you, the critical level at which you wouldn't expect a response from fertilizer is around 120 parts per million potassium. So we're extremely deficient potassium. So in 2019, it was pretty wet, so we didn't get it planted until about July 3rd. In 2020, we were much more timely. Got the soybeans planted in May of 2013, or sorry, May 13th of 2020. And the corn we planted the same day, but we had emergent failure, so we didn't get a replant until June 8th. The varieties were, you know, a 3.7 maturity and a 4.0 maturity, and a similar varieties for 2020 with a 3.6 maturity and then the same 4.0 maturity that we had in 2019. And then the corn hybrids 1197 and 1464, which are pretty common pioneer hybrids for this area. Both years the potash was applied, you know, 3 or 4 weeks before planting, and both fields were no-tilled, so there was no incorporation of the potassium fertilizer after it was applied and before planting. So these are the 2 yield charts from 2019 and 2020. there was no difference between varieties in either year. So this data is just the two varieties added together, averaged together. Something interesting is that, you know, this 2019, we planted in July, so this is sort of double crop yields. And, you know, the 2020 is much more realistic of a full season soybean crop. However, both years, although drastically different yield, the same agronomic and economic optimum fertilizer rates were realized at 270 pounds per acre of potash for 2020 and 2019. The economic optimum, using $365 per ton for potash and $10 bushel soybeans, results in an economic optimum just less than the agronomic, you know, which if you look at that curve, the incremental benefit of adding potash declines as you become less deficient in potassium. So that's why your economic optimum is slightly less than your agronomic optimum. Something to note is, you know, if somebody is renting a new field, or, you know, just obtained the field through purchase and has a very low soil test, or maybe they don't think they're going to be able to farm it next year, they might say that, you know, I'm only going to put on the amount of potassium that the crop is going to use this year. So, for example, if you were using the 2020 yield data and you fertilized for 75 bushel beans, you would have put on about 150 pounds of potash. However, if you see from this this trend line, or fertilizing at 150 pounds would have been about a 10 bushel reduction from the optimum rate. So what you would have had is about, you know, going from crop removal to the economic optimum, you would have spent an extra $20 in potash per acre, but you would have had a net gain in about $80 per acre by fertilizing this economic optimum versus just crop removal. So you're going to benefit the next person who farms it, but it also benefits you. Again, it was no-till, so you might be concerned about stratification of potash or potassium in the soil. But a 60 bushel bean crop takes up the equivalent of about 283 pounds of potash. So at this 75 bushel sort of maximum in 2020, that soybean would have accessed, you know, almost all of the potash that we applied to the field. So I don't think stratification of nutrients was an issue in either year. So it's important to be able to identify field deficiencies, potassium deficiency in the field. One method we tried using was remote sensing. We basically used a camera that was mounted on a drone, took a picture of the field, and then compared the plots using an index from the picture with the yield. And as you can see from both of these charts, 2019 and 2020, this visible atmospheric resistance index that we used was highly correlated to yield. Something that is important to note is that these low yielding plots here, you obviously could have picked up in the field those kind of symptoms just walking through the plot. However, these points here kind of towards the middle, although they were severely deficient as far as your optimum yield, you cannot have really seen the potassium deficiency symptoms out in the field. Now we had the benefit in this trial of comparing, you know, a high potash treatment to a very low potash, and we can tell that those moderately yielding plots were deficient in potassium. In a commercial field setting, if you had an index value of 0.3, it really wouldn't mean anything to you unless you had something to compare it to. So what some people do is they might apply a strip of double fertilizer, or they might skip a fertilizer pass so that they can have that sort of maximum or minimum greenness that they can compare the rest of the field to. So these are pictures from the 2020 plots. The top left is the 0K treatment. The top right is the 75-pound potash treatment. And then the middle is 150. So like I said, the 0 treatment, you can obviously tell walking through the field that it's severely deficient in potassium. The 75-pound treatment is a little bit different story. You might be able to see a little bit of deficiency in that bottom left corner of that picture, but if you walked through the plot, you really wouldn't be able to pick up on too many leaves that had that characteristic potassium deficiency. Now, the middle picture, that 150-pound rate, is 100 pounds less than the optimum, but honestly, walking through the plot, they look fantastic. That clipboard that I'm holding there is sitting on top of a yardstick. So those soybeans are over 3 foot tall, bushy. They're 30-inch rows and they close the gap. So, if you were walking that field, you would say these soybeans look great, even though the optimum fertilizer rate was 100 pounds more than what is shown in this picture here. So another way to identify deficiency is through tissue testing. We tissue sampled in 2019 at the R3 growth stage. The tri-state threshold where you would expect a deficiency to occur is around 2%, which is on this x-axis here. There's the 2. And A&L Great Lakes, which is where we sent these samples, they say maybe slightly less at 1.7 as their threshold. What this data shows is, one, that those thresholds are probably fairly accurate since our soybean yield tended to sort of max out around that 1.7 to 2% potassium tissue level. The other thing that this gives the potential for is testing maybe at an earlier growth stage at maybe V4 or V6. And if you receive a deficient tissue test, there's an opportunity for maybe a mid-season application of a potassium-containing fertilizer to maybe make up that difference in potassium deficiency. So lastly, the way you can sort of determine deficiency is through soil testing. Like I said earlier, we're severely deficient in soil, so we're not going to hit that critical level anytime soon. But if you are curious of how quick you can reach that sort of critical level of 120, what this research here has shown that it takes roughly 10 pounds of K2O per acre to change the soil test by 1. Now, some earlier research and other research shows that maybe that ratio is closer to maybe 8 pounds of K2O to change it by 1, but it's relatively close. So if you were to bring the soil test from 25 parts per million, which is where this field started, all the way up to the critical level of 120, our 300-pound treatment resulted in about a 13 parts per million increase in soil test. If you did that every year and you averaged 60 bushel an acre soybeans, you would take about 8 to 9 years to reach the critical level. But if you say that the economic optimum is 250 and you're going to fertilize that and you average 60 bushel beans, it's going to take about 12 to 16 years to reach that critical level, that soil critical level. So something to maybe take home from that is that if you take over a field and your landlord wants to see your potassium levels increase, you might show them something like this and say that it does take time for soil potassium levels to significantly increase or decrease. It won't be a one-year job. So I'm going to briefly talk about the corn we had, which was in the residual plot. So the left chart here was the residual plots where we applied the potash treatments to the soybeans in 2019, and then just planted the corn in 2020 with no fertilizer. The chart here on the right was we had the potash treatments in the soybeans in 2019 plus the same treatment in 2020 before the corn planting. Something to note is that there was no difference in response between hybrids at the optimum level. However, at low soil test potassium, the Pioneer 1197 hybrid accessed more potassium than the 1464. So you don't hope to ever be in a situation where you're deficient in potassium, but if that is the case, you know, the hybrid that you use could respond differently. The agronomic optimum for the fertilized plots were around 230 pounds an acre, and that was just below a yield of 250 bushel an acre. Again, the economic optimum was slightly less at about 223 pounds. The tri-state fertilizer recommendations would have recommended about 260 pounds per acre. So this research shows that the optimum was actually slightly less than maybe what the tri-state would have recommended. And then I just wanted to emphasize again that the corn visual symptoms was pretty much the same story as the soybeans. So the zero treatment is the corn stalk on the far right. And then the second from the right is the 75-pound treatment all the way up to the 300-pound potash treatment on the far left. Walking through that 0K plot, you can obviously tell that it is deficient in potassium. It barely puts on an ear. But then you start walking through the 75-pound treatment. If you have something to compare it to, you could say that, yes, it was deficient. But if you're walking through that, you know, cornfield, and that's the only thing you have to compare it to, it would be very, very difficult to identify the potassium deficiency. So again, it is important to tissue test or use some sort of method to identify if your field is actually limiting in potassium. So just to summarize what I sort of rushed through there is fertilizing for crop removal at the low soil K cannot achieve your optimum yield. So if you inherit ground that is very low, it is insufficient to only apply what you're going to take off. Visual symptoms were not a sufficient indicator of nutrient deficiency. So it's important to soil test or tissue test because you're not going to be able to see the deficiency. And if you do, you are extremely deficient. And then lastly, the residual fertilizer in the corn was insufficient for optimum yields in fields testing very low for K. So if you do inherit a field that is very low in potassium, it would be a good strategy to fertilize every year versus trying to fertilize every other year. And then, of course, we need to thank the people who are funding the research. So Nutrien directly is funding so a lot of the samples. A&L, Great Lakes, and SureTech are supporting this research through reduced testing costs. Purdue pesticide programs provided some funds for some sampling, and Corteva Ag helped us harvest the plots this year. So I think Jim is going to talk a little bit about the new tri-state fertilizer recommendations.
Hey, Dr. Camberato, are you there? Alex, while we have a minute, maybe to figure out some audio difficulties with Dr. Camberato, could you answer the question in the chat? Someone asked, how would strip till with dry fertilizer change your results?
how would dry fertilizer with strip till change the results? I'm not sure it would change the results all that much, because I guess if you're expecting the banding to help the plant access the potassium easier or have access to more of the potassium, I don't think that really occurred because, as I kind of said, you know, a 60 bushel per acre soybean crop required like an equivalent of 283 pounds of potash. So at that 75 pound or 75 bushel per acre yield in 2020, that soybean crop had to have been accessing almost all of the fertilizer that was applied. So I guess, yeah, if your question is by, you know, banding the nutrient, you know, giving the plant more access to it, I don't think it would have changed the results in this scenario that much, I guess. I guess I also saw, so is potash mobile? I guess if I have time, I can maybe answer that a little bit. So it is slightly mobile in the soil, but if you think about this scenario that I'm talking about, it's a no-till field, so most of the potassium is only going to leach into the maybe top couple inches of the soil, but you know, some 80% of your root mass is also going to be up in that very top layer of the soil profile. So you know, although there will be significant stratification of the nutrient, it's going to be stratified in an area where the roots are also stratified.
Thanks, Alex. Dr. Camberato, can you hear us now? We're having some audio difficulties. Looks like you're there.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Loud and clear. Go ahead.
Is my screen being shared or?
Right now, we just see you on the screen. You should have sharing capabilities if you'll try that again.
Let's see. Nah, I don't see the share. Can you just put up my slides?
Yes, 1 second. If you go ahead and introduce it, I'll get it pulled up for you.
So I'm going to follow up a little bit on what Alex talked about, and to present the updated tri-state fertilizer recommendations and the changes that are specific to potassium. The update came out just a week or two ago, and it's available there. Yeah, there it is. It's available at that website. You can download a PDF copy. It's a little cumbersome of a download. They have to send you an email, so they're obviously tracking who gets it, but it's free. Or if you want a paper copy, you can order one from that same address, and it's only $9 a copy. So that's pretty good for a pretty big bulletin like this. And it's a joint effort of Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, as it was back in '95 when the last version was published. Alex mentioned, yeah, next slide, please, John. Yeah, Alex mentioned that we'll be reporting in Malic 3 instead of ammonium acetate for potassium, and that's the soil test method. And some laboratories have been using that method for 20+ years and converting from the Malic 3 back to the ammonium acetate. And so we decided, since the larger labs, the predominance of the samples are done with the Malic 3, that we would write the recommendations in Malic 3. And they don't change a whole lot with potassium. The old number times 1.14 would equal the new number. And both methods are excellent at making, or they're as good as each other as making fertilizer recommendations. We simplified it back again. We simplified it a little. Before, you had a different critical level or maintenance range for every cation exchange capacity. And now we just have one for sandy soils or CECs less than 5, and another maintenance range for CECs greater than 5. And so you don't have to know what this critical level is at 5 milliequivalents and 6 and 7 and 8 and 10 and 15 and 20. You just have these two ranges to remember. Next slide, please. Alex talked a little bit about how recommendations are made, in that when soil test is really low, we make a high fertilizer recommendation, and that's called the build-up phase. And we recommended fertilizer to maximize the yield of the crop, fully replace crop removal, and then some extra each year for 4 years in order to build the soil up into the maintenance range or the optimal level. And that's a pretty conservative approach, and was designed when people owned the land or had long-term leases. And having a moderate soil test level gives one the flexibility of skipping a fertilizer application when needed because of price or access to the field, without losing yield and profit due to that lost yield. And then the maintenance region for potassium would be replacing crop removal plus about 20 pounds of potassium per acre. And that 20 pounds extra compensates for the leaching loss of some potassium in low cation exchange soils and the fixation of potassium in some of the heavier clay soils. And then the third region of this or phase of this philosophy is the drawdown phase, where we recommended less than crop removal at higher soil test levels to gradually let the soil test level fall into the maintenance range. And that was because people didn't sample all that frequently, and they sampled fields pretty coarsely. A single sample represented a large acreage. And that's not true today. We have much more intensive sampling, more frequent sampling, and probably more accurate sampling and analysis. So next slide, please. Well, in the next slide, it shows that that drawdown range has been removed. Yeah. And so the recommendation goes to 0 at the upper limit of the maintenance range. And those are two numbers up there represent that critical level and the maintenance limit. And it should be for a soil with a CEC of more than 5, the critical level should be 140 parts per million, not 100. And then the upper level is 170 parts per million. Next slide, please. One of the things that has changed quite a bit for potassium is the amount of potassium removed in the grain. Thousands of samples have shown that for all 3 crops, corn, soybeans, and wheat, the amount of potassium per bushel of grain removed from the field is anywhere from about 20 to 30% lower than it was in our old recommendations. So even though yields have increased, the amount of potassium removed from the field has not increased as much because the concentration in the grain is actually less. Next slide. This just shows what the recommendations would be if one was in the maintenance range and the optimum soil test levels, and for corn and soybeans. And I highlighted there the new, on top, the new recommendations in the old. And you see for any given yield, the amount removed is only about 10 or less than 15 pounds of K2O per acre less now than it was due to that lower concentration. Next slide. Well, that's just a quick overview. If you want more detail, please download this publication. If you have any questions, please email me. And at the CCA conference this year, well, not at the crop management workshop in January, we'll be talking about all of the important changes in the tri-state fertilizer recommendations. If you want to attend that meeting, we'll get into the phosphorus and nitrogen changes as well. So thank you, John. I'll hand it back to you.
Dr. Camberato, thank you so much. We do have one quick question for you while we have just a little bit of time. We're just a little bit over. We had a question about the updated recommendations. Will those be incorporated into A&L software, A&L Great Lakes, their software for testing?
Yeah, you would have to ask them. I believe they will be. That was our anticipation for that.
Thank you again so much, Dr. Camberato.